topic of today's study will be Jacob's feud with his father-in-law, Genesis chapter 31. In Genesis chapter 30, we read about all of the children Jacob had with his 4 different wives and the story behind how each one was conceived. And these weren't just any old children. This was a special family. In fact, like I mentioned last time, if you make it to heaven and you enter into New Jerusalem, you're not going to help but see the names of all of these children that were being conceived here in this last chapter. And not only will you see the names there, but the names of each child tell the story of how they were conceived. It tells the whole dramatic account of, the struggle between Leah and Rachel, and how they were trying to beat each other out on who could have more children and so forth. So every time we enter into the gates of that new city, Holy Jerusalem, Heavenly Jerusalem, we're going to be reminded of this story just by the meanings of the children's names. And I think that's fascinating. For whatever reason, God wanted that to be there for us to never forget. And at the close of chapter 30, we also discovered how Jacob got the upper hand in a business deal that he made with Laban concerning what cattle belonged to which person there. So, and this is going to, because Jacob got the upper hand, it's going to actually affect his relationship between he and Laban, his uncle and father-in-law. And like always, when we go through these passages or these chapters in the Bible, even in the Old Testament, there will be some significant spiritual, moral, and prophetic lessons as we go through here. So we're going to try to draw those out as we go as well. All right, Genesis chapter 31, verse 1, and it reads, "And he heard the words of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's, and that which was our father's hath he gotten all this glory." So his son, Laban's sons here, they're jealous. That they're basically saying that Jacob became great because of Laban's wealth. And this is untrue because, excuse me, none of Jacob's riches actually came from Laban. They came from God's blessings, as we discovered all throughout the reading as we read through that. And in fact, it was actually Jacob who made Laban wealthy. It was the other way around. So these sons have it backwards. They obviously they're favoring their dad, and they're upset because because Jacob got the better end of the deal here. But it was a fair deal, as Jacob's going to explain in the coming verses here. Verse 2, "And Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before." Now, apparently, Laban, though he was kind of a shady guy, he was normally upbeat and friendly with Jacob as long as he was getting his way, as long as he was benefiting from all of the agreements that they've made thus far. And but at this point now, Laban feels like Jacob disgraced him because he outsmarted Laban, and Laban now has got a sour countenance about him. And he kind of reminds me a little bit, Laban does, of like a corrupt mob boss. He's, your family, I love you, you're my buddy, you're kin. But then if you cross him or get the better end of the deal, family then doesn't matter anymore. They'll knock off whoever for their own personal gain. I wouldn't say he was quite that corrupt, but he kind of had that mentality of all Laban cared about was enriching himself. Verse 3, "And the Lord said unto Jacob, Return unto the land of thy fathers, and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee." So, it's time for Jacob to get back home. No doubt Jacob probably didn't mind being gone here for almost 20 years. Because if you remember, Esau, when Jacob left, Esau was pretty hot. Esau wanted to kill him, and he needed to get out of there so that things could cool down. And there's no better healer than time when it comes to anger and things like that. So about 20 years now, I'm sure Esau's probably calmed down. He's moved on with his life. He's not as angry as he was. And he'll come into the picture in the later chapters. As the coming weeks come upon us. We'll see that. But let's move on. Verse 4, and Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field unto his flock. And he said unto them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not toward me as before, but the God of my father hath been with me. Again, Jacob recognized there's something wrong. Laban is not looking at me like he used to. And this isn't just his feelings are hurt type of look. No, Jacob is very suspicious that Laban is going to do something very devious against him. If you can remember, somebody else had a sour countenance after they were upset about how God accepted their offering and accepted the brother's offering and not his. I'm talking about Cain. Remember, God said, why is your countenance fallen to Cain? So there's a lot you can tell by somebody's countenance. When somebody gets to this state of being where they are thinking murder in their heart, there is something that you can discern, evidently here, by the look on their face. Something very evil comes about them. I have no doubt it's evil spirits and things like that come on a person and then transform them into, transform their thoughts into evil thoughts, okay? Really evil thoughts. But again, this was a fair deal that Jacob had made with Laban. It wasn't, Jacob didn't deceive him. He didn't defraud him. He just got the better end of the deal. And we're going to find out that God actually was the one that gave Jacob God gave Jacob specific advice on how to get the better end of this deal. Remember the spotted cattle and the ring-straight cattle and all that? We're going to read about it in a verse here. Jacob found a way to make, since the deal is that those would be his cattle, the ring-straight, the spotted, and so forth. He figured out a way to have them breed more than the other cattle. All right? And he's going to explain it here in a second here, but let's see here. Moving on, verse 4. And Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field unto his flock. So it's kind of an emergency meeting he's having with his wives. He's going to explain it here actually, so I'm just going to read it here. And he said unto them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not toward me as before, but the God of my father hath been with me. It was God that was with Jacob. It was God that was blessing Jacob. It wasn't Laban. It wasn't anything of Laban. It was Almighty God. So again, Laban's upset. His countenance is fallen. Jacob's explaining this to his wives. And he knows this is a very dangerous and volatile situation. It's verse 6. And he says, you know that with all my power, I have served your father. I've served you. I've been loyal to your father. I've worked hard for him. I have not withheld anything back. And your father, verse 7, and your father hath deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God suffered him not to hurt me. So I don't know if it was literally 10 times. It's probably a figure of speech, meaning that Laban defrauded Jacob every time they made a deal. Laban never upheld it, or he figured out a way to cheat Jacob out of something that was his. And again, Laban was corrupt. He was greedy and only cared about the wealth that Jacob could make for him. And he took advantage of it. He took advantage of his own son, what would it be? No, not son-in-law. Well, it would be son-in-law. His own nephew. He was also his uncle. So anyways, actually, you know what? I'm going to comment a little bit here. There's a lesson we can learn here. Jacob said that I served your father with all my power. Now, even in spite, or even though Laban cheated him, he didn't get sour on Laban. He just kept working hard. And there's a lesson for that. For us today as Christians even, when we are under somebody's authority, just because they don't treat us right or they're not being fair with us, it doesn't mean that we should then start figuring out ways on our own to even the score ourselves. Some people would say, well, my boss, he's not paying me the right wage. That old bastard, he's unfair. And he might be. But then you don't go take it into your own hands and say, well, since since he's not paying me the wages I deserve, then he's gonna get the he's going to get the effort that he's paying for, basically. In other words, I'm going to scale back my work effort because he's not paying me what I deserve. He didn't do that. Jacob didn't do that. And a lot of people, it's tempting to want to do that. Or some people will actually steal from their employers because they feel that they've been cheated, so they figure, well, if I take a little bit here and there, I deserve it. I'm evening out the score. Jacob did not do that, okay? And in Colossians chapter 3, verse 22, we are taught that we are supposed to be obedient and respect those who are in authority over us, okay? And I'm going to read the verse here. Servants, obey. This is Colossians chapter 3, verse 22 through 25. Paul says, servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. And it didn't say anything about whether or not your master was a good master or not. And whatsoever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord you shall receive the reward of the inheritance. For you serve the Lord Christ. But he that doeth wrong, or someone that decides to take matters in their own hands, he that doeth wrong shall receive for the wrong which he hath done, and there is no respect of persons. So in other words, if we're working for an employer, that employer is in essence our master, and we are to work, even if they're an unfair employer, while we're there, we're to work as though we're serving the Lord. Continually work hard. Now think of it, if Christians decided they were going to, think of how damaging it would be to Christianity if every time we had a bad boss, we would figure out a way to get, to steal back from him or to drag our feet and be lazy and say, I'll show him, I'm not going to work hard if he's not paying me. How does that make Christians look if Christians started doing that? It would make us look no better than the world. But just think of the high moral ground that that Jacob's coming out with here, because he never did that. Now he can boldly stand up against Laban's injustice here and defend himself during the rest of this chapter, because he did not give in to temptation to give him what he deserves, so to speak. All right, let's continue on. Verse 8, if he said thus, the speckled shall be thy wages, then all the cattle bear speckled. And if he said thus, the ringstake shall be thy hire, then bear all the cattle ringstake. In other words, Jacob is explaining every time Laban said, okay, I'm going to give you the speckled, then God blessed the speckled and they produced. So it just kept working out in Jacob's favor that way. Verse 9, thus, now check this out. Thus God hath taken away the cattle of your father and hath given them to me. In other words, he's explaining to his wives that it was God's doing all along. God was the one evening the score. So if we got a bad employer or a bad boss, just be patient, work hard. You can find another job that you can do that too. But if you stay there, or God might move you to another place. But the bottom line is God will find a way. If you're always working hard wherever you're at, he's going to find a way to bless you and reward you, just like he's doing with Jacob here. All right. I am going to stop here and tie this into some current national events that are happening with our country today. Laban was always making business deals with Jacob, but Laban was always making them so they were unfair to Jacob, or he was not upholding his end of the bargain. Remember, Jacob, right off the bat, Jacob said he would serve Laban 7 years for Rachel, his younger daughter. What did Laban do? Well, then he gave him Leah, the oldest daughter, who he didn't want to marry. He tricked him into marrying her, and then said, well, if you stay with me and work with me another 7 years, then I'll give you Rachel. So it's interesting because a lot of these things tie in so closely with what's been happening to America today. We've made all these different trade deals with Canada, Mexico, Europe, and these deals only were made to benefit them, these other countries. And they've been taking advantage of us for decades now. And the Christians in America have been the fueling force for all these blessings that these other nations have gotten. It's not, a lot of countries have been made rich or have been subsidized by the hard work of Christian Americans. Just like Laban was subsidized by the hard work of, not just the hard work, but the hard work and the blessings of Jacob. It's no different today. But now we finally have, it's interesting because Jacob's now departing. He's in the process of departing from Laban. And all the corrupt deals now, the score is being made even, and Jacob's actually coming out with more than Laban at the end of the story because he deserved it. But today we have a president that has put an end to, or has drawn, has put his foot down and said, no more unfair trade deals for America. This has been unfair. It's been, you guys have been scamming us. You're not paying your fair share. And it's beautiful to see. It kind of reminds me of what happened here with Jacob. Finally, God evens the score after a period of time, after a period of 20 years. All right. Verse 10, and it came to pass at the time that the cattle conceived that I lifted up mine eyes, and I saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which leaped upon the cattle were ring-straked, speckled, and grizzled. Now those are the ones that Laban said he could have because traditionally these were the less desirable animals. And so Laban thought, well, yeah, that sounds like a great deal. I'll give you the less desirable animals because I'll get the best. But then it turned around where these were the animals that actually produced more, conceived more multitudes of other cattle. Verse 11, and the angel of the Lord spake unto me in a dream, saying, Jacob. And I said, here am I. So check this out. God actually tells him to do this in a dream. This hasn't been explained yet. And he's explaining this to his wife that, hey, he didn't come up with his own this plan himself to trick his father-in-law Laban. God told him to do it. Verse 12, and he said, lift up now thine eyes and see all the rams which heap upon the cattle. Heap means they were going to conceive, right? Heap upon the cattle are ring-straked, speckled, and grizzled. Now check this out, for I have seen all that Laban doeth unto thee. For these 20 years, Jacob could have been sitting there crying in his pillow saying, Laban's unfair to me. I'm not going to serve him. He doesn't pay me right. He keeps ripping me off. But no, Jacob stayed the course, and God said he saw everything that Laban did, and he's making it even now. Okay? So that's, we have to trust God. I mean, that was 20 years. We think in terms of 2 days. If we don't get what we want in 2 days, we blame God and say, you thought you were gonna make this all happen for me. It doesn't seem like it, right? So again, the moral of the story here is work hard, don't complain, and God will even the score. He sees what's going on in our individual lives, just like he did Jacob. He's not some God floating around somewhere, unconcerned about what's happening down here. He knows what's going on, and he knows when people are taking advantage of us, and he wants us to trust him and wait for his timing. Verse 13, I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointest the pillar, and where thou vowedest a vow unto me. Now arise, get thee out of this land, and return unto the land of thy kindred. In essence here, Jacob now is being told to be independent, to get away, to break away from his uncle and father-in-law. And I can't help but also see some parallels here with America and how we declared our dependence from an unjust master over in Britain there named King George, who was treating the colonies very poorly. And then eventually America did gain its independence and freedom to be out from under the shadow of our uncle, so to speak. Isn't there a terminology for was it Uncle Jack or something like that? That Great Britain used to be called. I can't remember what that was now. All right, I'll think about it later. Maybe we'll bring it up. But verse 14, and Rachel and Leah answered and said unto him, is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Now check this out. Rachel and Leah now are saying, where's our inheritance of our fathers? From our father. Verse 15, are we not counted of him strangers? For he has sold us and hath quite devoured also our money. Now, it appears as though it was customary at this time for the father to leave his daughters some portion of the dowry that was given to them. Now, Jacob, or some kind of inheritance. Now, remember, Jacob worked 7 years, or actually 14 years, for these daughters. Now, all that money was not actually supposed to go to Laban alone, because it was a dowry. It was a payment made by a man who paid to have the right to marry another man's daughter. And part of that dowry was actually supposed to then go to the daughter. It's the daughter herself. But Laban must not have given them any part of that. And he's treating his daughters really much the same as he treated Jacob. Just mere tools to build up his own wealth. And that's why they said, hey, he's treating us, he's just selling us. He's just using us. Our father, he's not doing this right. All he cares about is lining his own pockets. And we're just basically, possessions that he sold to gain more money. So he obviously was a very greedy, unjust man here, this Laban character. Verse 16, for all the riches which God hath taken from our father, that is ours and our children's. Now then, whatsoever God has said unto thee, do. Now, it's interesting here. Basically, Jacob is consulting with his wives. He's saying, hey, there's something wrong with your father, Laban. His countenance has fallen. It didn't say it in the text, but he obviously is fearing. He's fearing that Laban will do something very tragic, very wrong to him. And his daughters have now agreed to go with him. They've agreed to leave their father, to go back with Jacob to his father and his his family back in the land of Canaan. And one of the reasons they agreed to do it is because they realize they're actually siding with Jacob that, yeah, our father treated us like mere possessions, not as daughters. Verse 17, then Jacob rose up and set his sons and his wives upon camels. He's getting out of there. And he carried away all his cattle and all his goods, which he had gotten, the cattle of his getting, which he had gotten in Padam Aram, for to go to Isaac his father in the land of Canaan. Now this had been 20 years he's been away from his father. I don't even know how he knows his father's alive. Maybe there's ways of sending dispatchers back and forth, maybe merchants going back and forth between the two lands, or whatnot. But this has got to be really pressing on his heart to get back home, no doubt, and to be out from under the umbrella of Laban. Verse 19, and Laban went to shear his sheep, and now check this out, and Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. These images were idols. These were false gods. And no doubt they were made of precious metals, either silver or gold. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But very, very bad. Now, remember we talked about how Jacob was not evening the score himself? What did Rachel and Leah just get done saying? Our father treated us poorly. He just sold us away just to line his own pockets. So now Rachel has it in her mind that probably that she's going to even the score. Since her father didn't give her an inheritance, she's going to go take her inheritance. Not good. Verse 20. And Jacob stole away unawares to Laban the Syrian, in that he told him not that he fled. In other words, Jacob is leaving without telling Laban. He's escaping because, no doubt, I believe he's afraid for his life. Verse 21, so he fled with all that he had and rose up and passed over the river and set his face toward the Mount Gilead. Okay, he's heading back towards, he's heading from what we call modern day Turkey today in that general region down, southwest to the land of Canaan. All right. And he's going, seems like he's going at a pretty decent clip here. Verse 22, and it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob was fled. So finally, it looks like Jacob's about 3 days ahead of him. This was probably a normal thing where Jacob would be herding his cattle out in the field or grazing his cattle out in the field, and they'd be apart from each other, maybe a day or so. But now Laban finds out that he's farther away than he should be. Something's wrong. And Jacob, no doubt he knows that Jacob's now running away from him. Verse 23, and he took his brethren with him and pursued after him 7 days' journey, and they overtook him in the Mount Gilead. Like I said, this could make these chapters in Genesis could make great movies. I mean, you see all this drama happening here, and now Laban's now chasing Jacob down, and he catches up to him, and let's see what's going to happen here. And God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night, and said unto him, take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Now, this is fascinating. It's interesting how God sometimes talks directly to men who are not even in covenant with him. God came to Pharaoh at times. He came to Nebuchadnezzar. So God sometimes will come to other leaders or other people when it involves his own children. Now think about that. Sometimes we think that God doesn't really pay attention to what's going on in our lives. But when he intervenes in the affairs of Jacob here and actually gives this Laban a dream and says, you better not touch Jacob. You don't say anything good or bad concerning him. God's given him a warning. So, again, I mean, God he will come and actually at times talk to heathens in dreams and whatnot in order to benefit his children or to protect his own children. All right, check this out. Verse 25, then Laban overtook Jacob, and now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban and his brethren pitched in the mount of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, what hast thou done, that thou hast stolen away unawares to me, you left without telling me, and carried away my daughters as captives with the sword. So now we see this is going to be a pretty heated argument here. Now Laban's saying, why did you leave like that? And it's like you're capturing my daughters and taking them away from me. Verse 27, wherefore didst thou flee away secretly and steal away from me, and didst not tell me, now check this out, that I might have sent thee away with mirth and with songs and with tabret and with harp. Now, do you really think Laban was going to do this for Jacob? He's like the prototype of a hypocrite. When he's in an argument with somebody, he says, well, I would have done this for you. I would have done that for you. And they would have never done that. They just say that they were going to do that to try to give themselves some kind of a moral high ground. Laban wouldn't have done this. He would have only come up with some other scheme to try to get Jacob to stay. Verse 28, and hast thou not suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters, and all my grandchildren? Thou hast now done foolishly in so doing. Okay? So now he's blaming Jacob. He says, how could you do? You're not even letting me kiss my grandchildren goodbye. Verse 29, and it is in the power of my hand to do you hurt. But the God of your father spake unto me yesterday night, saying, take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. So no doubt Laban had more strength in numbers than Jacob had, and Laban's using that to his advantage, basically trying to lord it over Jacob by saying, I could do you a lot of hurt. You're lucky. You're lucky that God came to me in a dream, or I would, I might have hurt you. Okay, it's interesting. God stepped in at a critical moment, because had God not stepped in, no doubt Laban probably would have hurt Jacob. I believe he probably would have killed Jacob, took his wives and all of his belongings back home, and blamed it on Jacob and said Jacob left and he was dishonest and whatever. And now, though, thou wouldest needs be gone, because thou sore longest after thy father's house. Yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods? So now check this out. Now he knows that his idols are missing, and he's blaming it on Jacob. He thinks Jacob stole his gold or silver gods that he had for whatever purposes. But Laban's basically saying, hey, I understand. Here he is again. Always trying to take the high ground. I understand why you wanted to leave so bad. You miss your father. That's understandable. But you didn't just leave for that purpose. You left and you stole my gods from me. How dare you? How dare you steal my precious idols? Verse 31, and Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid, for I said, peradventure. Now check it out, because I was afraid. Why was Jacob afraid? Because he saw Laban's countenance. Just like Cain had a poor countenance. He knew something evil had come upon the man. He was he was thinking bad thoughts. For I said, peradventure thou wouldest take by force thy daughters from me. So Jacob, this is what he said to Laban. He said, hey, I left because I was afraid. I thought you were going to take my wives from me. And it would end very bad. So this is from Jacob here. This is an honest answer. Obviously this would sound reasonable to Laban, knowing that the situation and knowing that he observed a drastic change in his countenance. So let's see what happens next. Verse 32: with whomsoever thou findest thy gods, let him not, this is Jacob speaking, he says, with whomsoever thou findest thy gods, let him not live. Before our brethren, discern thou what is with me, and take it to thee, for Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen them. Now this is pretty a bad situation that could unfold here. Jacob just gave Laban permission to put to death anybody who if he finds someone with the stolen images, and Rachel, his favorite wife, has them and he doesn't know about it. And he also says, and you can go through any of our tents, anything that's yours, you take back. Okay, if you find anything that's yours that doesn't belong to us. Verse 33, and Laban went into Jacob's tent, and into Leah's tent, and into the two maidservants' tents, but he found them not. Then went he out of Leah's tent, and entered into Rachel's tent. Remember, Rachel stole them. What's going to happen? Now Rachel had taken the images and put them in the camel's furniture and sat upon them, and Laban searched all the tent, but found them not. And she said to her father, let it not displease my lord that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me. And he searched, but found not the images. So in other words, she's sitting on this camel, and she tells her father, and the idols she's actually sitting on them, covering them. And she uses the excuse that she's having her monthly menstrual cycle, and she's unclean, and she says, please don't make me get up off of my seat here because I'm unclean. And no doubt Laban's back then, during those days, they didn't have quite the modern sanitary devices to keep things clean, and no doubt he's probably like, I don't want, no, okay, that's fine, I'm not going over there, all right, I believe you. Okay, and he must have trusted his dad. He must have had a little bit more trust in her, and so he thought, okay, no, but they're not going to be under her or whatever. So she deceived her father. She got away with it. Kind of a maybe not such a good trait there in Rachel, Jacob's favorite wife. She steals this idol, and now she's lying about it. She's put everybody at risk. And notice Leah, the unfavorite wife, didn't do that. She didn't do anything like that. But Rachel did. Verse 36, and Jacob was wroth and chode with Laban. Now, Jacob's going to unload 20 years of pent-up frustration here now to his father-in-law. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, "What is my trespass and what is my sin that thou hast so hotly pursued after me?" Because now Jacob feels vindicated, right? Laban accused him of stealing his gods and they weren't there. Jacob has no idea that his wife still has them. But in Jacob's mind, Laban was way out of line here, and he probably thought he was making all this up. Verse 37, "Wherefore hast thou searched, whereas thou hast searched all my stuff, what hast thou found of all thy household stuff? Set it here before my brethren and thy brethren, and they may judge betwixt us both." In other words, he says, hey, if you found anything out of our tents that don't belong to us, you bring it here in front of everybody, and let everybody, let our two tribes, so to speak, judge between what's going on here. In other words, Laban found nothing of his inside of Jacob's tents, besides what Rachel was hiding here. So Jacob no doubt feels very vindicated here, and he's letting the old man have it, so to speak here. All right. He says, verse 38, "This 20 years have I been with thee. The ewes and thy she-goats have not cast their young, and the rams of thy flock have I not eaten." Verse 39, "That which was torn of beasts I brought not unto thee. I bear the loss of it. Of my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night." Now check this out. It was even customary back in those days, if someone was your hired servant, like a hired shepherd, kind of like how Jacob was, if another animal came in and killed, let's say if a lion came in and killed one of the sheep, it wouldn't be the shepherd, the paid shepherd's responsibility, because it was naturally, probably known that those things do happen. So you're not going to, the guy that owned the sheep is the one that was going to pay for the loss. But Jacob said, "I've actually taken the loss for you." So look at it. Jacob's saying, I've been out there with your animals here, protecting them. I've even taken the losses for you. The losses that should have been yours, they were actually mine. And then he goes in verse 40, he says, "Thus I was in the day of the drought, consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from mine eyes." In other words, I was up late, sometimes sleepless nights, watching over your flock, out in the cold, in the frost of the night, and basically this is the way you treat me. Verse 41, "Thus have I been 20 years in thy house. I have served thee 14 years for thy 2 daughters, and 6 years for thy cattle, and thou hast changed my wages 10 times. All right, so he's letting him have it. "Except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had been with me, surely thou hadst sent me away now empty. God hath seen mine affliction and the labor of mine hands, and rebuked thee yesterday night." Okay? In other words, Jacob's actually calling out Laban. He's saying, if God didn't come to you last night, you would have sent me away empty without your daughters. I know you would have. You're a crook. You're a fraud. And, he's saying this in front of everybody. So he's really mad. He's, again, 20 years of pent-up anger, and he's letting him have it. So I guess he wasn't completely totally obedient to his master. He did lose it at the end here, but that's because his master accused him of doing something he didn't do. Verse 43, "And Laban answered and said unto Jacob, These daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children, and these cattle are my cattle. All that thou seest is mine. And what can I do this day unto these my daughters, or unto their children which they have borne?" So now Laban, after getting chided strongly by Jacob, now Laban's kind of backing up a little bit in this argument. And he's saying, hey, these are my grandchildren, you're my family. And he's playing Mr. Nice Guy now, saying, hey, I wouldn't have hurt how could I hurt any of you? You're my family. And no doubt, Laban, even though he's a corrupt guy, he's probably now feeling a little bit shamed at this point. He wasn't a totally bad guy. There were some good qualities in Laban, and I think he's realizing his wrong here. A little bit anyways. Verse 44, now therefore come thou, let us make a covenant, I and thou, and let it be for a witness between me and thee. Okay? So they're going to, now Laban's suggesting he wants to make a peace treaty with Jacob. It got to the point where things were so badly damaged between, their relationship was so badly damaged that this really was the only positive thing left to do. They needed to be separate at this time. Things got way too bad. Their relationship is too sour. The only thing they can do now is promise not to harm each other. And that, sometimes, with different nations that we deal with, sometimes our relationship could be so bad with them that there's no more friends, no more alliance, just we promise we're not going to attack you, you don't attack us, and they try to, it's a peace treaty, right? So there are peace treaties in the Bible. They're not unbiblical in all cases. Verse 45, and Jacob took a stone and set it up for a pillar. So now they're going to go through a formal ceremony here in recognition of this treaty. Verse 46, and Jacob said unto his brethren, gather stones, and they took stones and made an heap, and they did eat there upon the heap. Now notice, back in the day, whenever they made covenants or agreements with other people, whether it be a certain treaty, a peace treaty, or whatever it was, it was part of that covenant was having a meal together. Now in the Bible, we have this thing called the Holy Communion. It's let me put it this way: we have a peace agreement made between us and God, and it involves a meal. It involves breaking bread together. Because we are sinners and we deserve death, God actually made a peace agreement, and that was by the blood and body of Jesus Christ. That is the meal that we eat to gain that peace between Him and us. I mean, we deserve death. But He doesn't give it to us. So the idea, I guess my point is, the idea of a meal being eaten together between two parties in a covenant is not something new, and it's actually, it's the foundation of Christianity. We have a meal, it's called Holy Communion or the Last Supper. It's part of this peace treaty, so to speak, peace covenant. Fascinating. Verse 47, and Laban called it Jegar Shadutha, but Jacob called it Galeed. Now it's interesting, both of these words basically mean the same thing. And I read some commentaries on this. They said that Laban spoke a little bit of a different dialect than Jacob. It was more of a Syrian, where Jacob's would be more of I believe it would be, it'd be Hebrew. But they were they could communicate with each other in their own languages because they were so closely, they were so similar, so to speak. But both of these words basically mean the same thing. They mean a heap of stones. One in Laban's dialect and one in Jacob's dialect. Okay, a heap of stones. Verse 48, and Laban said, this heap is a witness between me and thee this day. Therefore was the name of it called Galeed. In verse 49, and Mizpah, for he said, the Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent from one another. If thou shalt afflict my daughters, or if thou shalt take other wives beside my daughters, no man is with us. See, God is witness betwixt me and thee. In other words, they're making a covenant between themselves and before Almighty God. So he's saying, if you violate this agreement, I might not see it, but God will see it. Verse 51, and Laban said to Jacob, behold this heap, and behold this pillar, which I have... Now it's Jacob's turn to say what this all stands for. It's his turn to give his demands of the treaty, so to speak, I guess. Behold this heap, and behold this pillar, which I have cast betwixt me and thee. This heap be witness, and this pillar be witness. In other words, this is a symbolic, these stones are symbolic. That I will not pass over this heap to thee, and that thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar unto me, now check this out, for harm. In other words, these heaps of stones were symbolic of a boundary between these two people. They would not cross it to hurt each other. Now remember, they were basically like halfway between each other's homelands. Okay, Jacob was going back to Isaac, his father, in the land of Canaan, and Laban came from north there by where modern day Turkey is. So this is kind of a halfway point. Interesting that the treaty would be made in kind of a halfway point, because that's a lot. Covenants and treaties are a lot of times a give and take. We're going to meet halfway. We'll come to an agreement here. But again, this was symbolic of a wall separating the two from harming one another. They're agreeing not to hurt each other. Verse 53, the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judged betwixt us, or between us, and Jacob sware by the fear of his father Isaac. Then Jacob offered sacrifice. Now another thing that was involved in a treaty or a covenant, sacred agreement, was a sacrifice. And we know Jesus was that sacrifice, right? And Jacob offered sacrifice. Jesus eventually was, he's not the sacrifice back here, obviously. And Jacob offered sacrifice upon the mount and called his brethren to eat bread, and they did eat bread, and they tarried all night in the mount. So they had one last sort of a friendly meal. I suppose it was kind of a little bit, it wasn't a jubilant time with each other, but it was more of, okay, this is our last meal together. We've got pretty bad blood between each other, but we're going to make the best of it, type of thing. Verse 55, and early in the morning Laban rose up and kissed his sons and his daughters and blessed them. And Laban departed and returned unto his place. All right. In conclusion, this piece, it's kind of sad to see this much strife in this family at this point, but it was a much better outcome than what could have been. Had God not intervened and came to Laban in a dream, Laban could have ended up killing Jacob, taking his daughters back, along with everything that Jacob now possessed, and it would have been a horrible thing. But now, after many years of putting his trust in God, Jacob is now free, he's wealthy, and he's ready to expand his kingdom. We're off to a bad situation is turning into a good part, or a necessary part of God's plan, so to speak. But there will be many, just because Jacob's now free of Laban's corruption and his ill business dealings and so forth, there will be many more challenges ahead for Jacob and his family, as we're going to see in the coming chapters in the book of Genesis. And just like today, we never have heaven on earth, so to speak, today. We're always going to have a new trial to go through, something new to overcome, until we finally get to the end of our life and it's over and we're in heaven. So we shouldn't expect rosy days, or if I get to a certain point, God's just going to make everything easy for me. No, there'll be a new obstacle to overcome, and that's the story of the Israelites from here on out to the end of the Bible, is trials and temptations, and what we're supposed to glean from that is we are to overcome all of those things. All right. Any questions or comments?
I was just thinking about Laban having all these different idols, or whatever they were, statues, and so obviously he's not a man of God. Mm-hmm. But yet, when God speaks to him, he listens and he has the fear of God, I'm assuming. So I don't know if it goes on, but it seems like Laban has a healthy fear of God, the right God.
Right.
Like, I wonder if he changed there then, or the stories in the future come up where he's a new man, or I don't know how far this story goes with Laban involved, but it's just interesting to me that that he listened to God and he had a fear of God, and I would think that would change a person. If God comes and speaks to you.
Yeah, if he comes to you in a dream, you'd think that would be right into shape.
Yeah, and then he actually does what's right and says, let's make a peace agreement. No harm to you. You take my daughters. And it even says he blessed them. He might have given them some things to go with or something. I don't know, but just thought that was interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with Laban's role in the future of the Bible here, but do they come back and is he a bad guy later, or you don't hear from him again?
That's a good question. I don't think we ever hear from him again. But yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, Laban, he obviously had the idols. He was an idolater, but yet at the same time, he still had a certain fear or reverence of God. I think he's not really that much different than many Christians today. Many Christians have a little bit of fear of God, but then they still have idols, all kinds of idols in their heart. Other things that really come before God, but then when it comes down to it, sometimes they'll do the right thing. So like I said, there are some good qualities of Laban, but there were many bad as well. So, he was actually, Abraham's father. So, Abraham's father, Terah, he was an idolater. And it was, I think we read about it earlier on in Genesis. He was an idol worshiper, so no doubt Laban became an idol worshiper because it was in the family. They came from, that area between the two rivers there, Babylon and so forth. But yeah, it seemed like it was a mixture. With Laban, it was a mixture. I can have my gods, and yet I do fear this other God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob type of thing. Any other questions or comments?
I also thought it was interesting that part of the deal is that he can't be with any other daughters. Like basically said, you can have my daughters, but you can't have any other wives.
Yeah.
Not sure why that was thrown in there, but...
Yeah, I mean, that does show, even though he did kind of use his daughters for his own personal gain, at the end, anyways, and I think he probably, when Jacob chided him so bad, I think that kind of pricked his heart a little bit, because he went right from, trying to justify himself, as he would have done, to all of a sudden, all right, let's make a peace treaty.
Right.
So maybe Jacob's chiding did have an effect upon him, and now he's legitimately looking out for his daughters by getting Jacob, because he doesn't want the idea would be if Jacob took on more daughters, that now his grandchildren, they could be shoved aside and Jacob could pick some other wives to put all the blessings onto, and he probably wants his bloodline to partake in the blessings.
Right.
Because he knows about the blessings that were given to Abraham. It was a known thing. Because when Isaac went there, he actually, Isaac didn't go there. When Abraham sent his chief servant to go get a wife for Isaac, he told, Laban was there when he told, in fact, I think Laban might have even been in place of his father, handing over, I think it would have been his sister, right? His sister, Rebecca. So, in other words, he wasn't a stranger to the news that God was choosing Abraham and this seed line through Isaac for a very special purpose. And no doubt he probably wanted to make sure his daughters were going to benefit from that.
Yeah. Overall, I love the study here in the Old Testament. And, I know bits and pieces of things, and you hear about Jacob and all the names that you hear throughout history, as a child. But I've never really got in-depth study myself on a lot of the Old Testament stuff. I've been more of a New Testament kind of person. So I love the line-by-line study of this, because I'm actually learning how this all started and what the importance of all these different people were. And I'm super interested. I mean, I'm not going to read ahead, because I'm learning it here. But seems like there's no consequences to her actions at this point. I don't know, coming up, there's going to be something that comes of it. I'm just super curious as to what's going to happen there. Do you know? I mean, is there something that comes of it one way or another, or is it just done?
You mean with Laban?
Her stealing the stuff from him. Obviously, there's going to be something that happens.
She's kind of punished.
Yeah, well, yeah. We don't have any direct. I mean, she ends up, dying after the birth of her son, her last son, Benjamin, her second son. She dies at that birth. And I can't remember if there's any other things, but it never said it was directly correlated with that. But knowing the Bible, you oftentimes will see.
Well, and even maybe that could have, God knew her heart. He probably knew, and maybe that's why her womb was closed for so long. Maybe that was part of her punishment. He knew that she.
Yeah, it just showed her heart
had that
in general.
That little bit of bitter spot in there or something.
It could be that Leah had a little bit better character than Rachel, but. And oftentimes that's the case. Sometimes the women that have the natural beauty don't have as solid of a character as someone who doesn't.
Humble.
Yeah. You have both, so you're okay.
Nice recovery.
Christian Overcomers is brought to you by the tithes and offerings of our listeners. If you would like to support our ministry, please go to ChristianOvercomers.com. God bless you, and thank you for your support.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible sword. His truth is marching on.